Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to briefly touch on last week's conversation because it connects so deeply to where we're going today. Last week, we talked about the gut-brain axis and the nervous system regulation, inflammation, emotional overwhelm, neurodivergence, and the reality that sometimes what we experience emotionally is not just in our head. We talked about how the body communicates long before we have language for what's actually happening. And I think today's conversation is really an extension of that. Because once I started looking deeper into my own nervous system experience, especially through the lens of perimenopause, it unexpectedly sent me down a rabbit hole. Ooh, I'm getting my goosebumps. Sent me down a rabbit hole that made me start looking at my life entirely differently. I was diagnosed with epilepsy at the age of 8. Then at age 10, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And now here I am at 42, navigating perimenopause and realizing that there's a very strong possibility that autism may have also been a part of the picture all along. And honestly, once I started researching the overlap between autism, ADHD, epilepsy, sensory processing, nervous system regulation, and hormonal changes in women, so many things suddenly started making sense. Not because I think my epilepsy diagnosis was wrong. I absolutely needed treatment for seizures as a child, but I do think there may have been a much bigger neurological picture happening that nobody knew to look for at the time, because autism in girls simply was not understood the way it's beginning to be understood now. And when I look back now, the signs were there. The sensory overwhelm, the emotional intensity, rejection sensitivity was huge. The masking, feeling different but not understanding why, the exhaustion from constantly trying to navigate this world in a way that felt harder for me than it seemed to feel for everyone else. And one thing that completely shocked me during this research was learning how significant the overlap between autism and epilepsy actually is. Now, let me preface that not everyone with epilepsy is autistic, and not every autistic person, not every autistic person has epilepsy. But autistic individuals are significantly more likely to experience seizures than the general population. And when I learned that, so many memories from my childhood suddenly started rearranging themselves in my mind. I personally had two different types of seizures growing up. I had petit mal seizures, which is what we often call absent seizures now, where it looks like someone is just simply staring off into space or disconnecting for a moment. And then I had what they call complex seizures, where I would lose one of my senses. And for me, it was my hearing. So if my back was turned to you during an episode, I genuinely would not know if you were speaking to me. And looking back now, I think about how many moments throughout my childhood may have been interpreted through the wrong lens. How many moments looked behavioral instead of neurological? How many moments looked like inattentiveness instead of nervous system disruption? How many moments left me feeling so confused, disconnected, embarrassed, and even more so misunderstood? And something else that I remember so clearly is my neurologist repeatedly telling us that epilepsy was hereditary. But nobody in my family has epilepsy. Nobody. Nobody has had epilepsy in generations past. And I remember even as a child trying to make sense of that, because when you're young, you assume doctors have all the answers. So when something doesn't fully add up, you almost learn to stop questioning it and just accept that your brain or body works differently somehow. But now, as I've started understanding more about neurodivergence and how differently autism can present in women and girls, I've found myself looking back at my own life with a completely different level of awareness and compassion. Not from a place of denying what I experienced, but from a place of finally trying to understand myself more fully. And I think that's an important distinction. So this conversation is not about trying to self-diagnose through social media or dismiss legitimate medical diagnosis. It's about recognizing that many women were treated for fragments of themselves while nobody stepped back to look at the full nervous system picture. And Heather, I'd love for you to talk more about that because historically women were not included in these conversations the way that they should have been. Can you speak more about how the medical system failed neurodivergent women for decades? I know there's some statistics. I think it's something like for the general population, 1 to 2% of people have epilepsy, but for the autistic population, it grows to about 20 to 30%, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. And just because you have autism does not necessarily mean you have a seizure disorder. And like you said, like correlation does not equal causation here. This is just looking at the statistics, right? So yeah, um,
Correct.
it's significantly more common in people with autism. Like you said, 20 to 30% of people with autism will develop epilepsy at some point in their life, because the hormonal fluctuation that we've been talking about with the estrogen and the progesterone actually affects your probability of having a seizure, right? So estrogen is a proconvulsant where the effects of it rising and falling can induce seizures, and the progesterone is the opposite, where it's an anticonvulsant, so those fluctuations can prevent the seizures. So when you add the already different hormonal makeup of, none of those words made sense. When you add the difference in the hormonal makeup of a neurodivergent person, and then add perimenopause on top of that, because that again changes the way your estrogen and your progesterone are developed, created, made within your body, that directly affects, whether or not you're going to have a seizure. And again, not everybody who gets perimenopause is going to develop a seizure disorder either, even if you are autistic. It's only 20 to 30%, but those hormone fluctuations can really have an effect on whether or not that happens. And then, we as neurodivergent people have sensory processing differences as well. So there's hypersensitivity, there's auditory and visual processing that's different. And that can intensify during the perimenopause period of our life because of the estrogen and, that decreasing, which really has an effect on those sensory processing abilities. And so that can play a role in the seizures as well, because a lot of them are brought on or triggered by some sort of sensory input. And that's different for everybody, but typically, I don't want to say, I'm just speaking in generalizations here, but that definitely can have an effect on whether or not those seizures develop.
I want to also add that in my research, I found that if an autistic person does have a seizure disorder with it or is accompanied with seizures, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a seizure disorder, it could just be accompanied with seizures,
Mhm.
that typically the seizures that accompany autism is usually petit mal, which is the absent seizures, the ones where you're just staring off into space or disconnected. But it's also they listed as the complex seizures. So both kinds that I had as a child are very common in autistic individuals. And that's what really kind of sent me down, not just the fact that I had epilepsy, but the fact that I had two kinds that were listed that were more common in autistic people. That's what sent me down the rabbit hole and learning the big overlap of of autism and epilepsy. And it became this really kind of emotional roller coaster going through this research, because I learned, that maybe it was not that, again, not that I didn't need, that it was not epilepsy, like disorder or whatever, but, and it really was autism, but it was the fact that, like, it was a misdiagnosis of sorts, while I still needed to treat the seizures, because when you have a seizure, it affects your brain drastically. Each seizure kind of impairs the brain a little bit. I don't know the statistics on that of how much, but that's another rabbit hole that I could go down. But it was the fact that back when I was a child, ADHD, autism, all these neurodivergent diagnoses were not talked about a lot because it was viewed as mental health disorder, right? That something was wrong with you. You were broken of sorts. And so they just pushed us aside, and it wasn't really talked about a whole lot. And I mean, I've even experienced that up until my most recent job. Before stepping into the classroom, my previous employer would say, well, that that's a mental health disorder. And I would just look at, and I snidely would look at him and be like, I'm fully aware of what that means. But, so we deal with those type of things all the time. And now that it's becoming more common, people are like, well, why is it showing up so much more? Well, it's not that it's more prevalent in people. It's just that we have more education and more research on it. And so I'm not upset at the fact that I was misdiagnosed or that it wasn't looked at, because honestly, they probably didn't have the tools or the knowledge to fully zoom out and see those things, especially me being a girl. They only really researched what the symptoms in boys and men were, so they weren't able to see it clearly in girls because it presented differently. And my symptoms very much presented differently than the typical autistic child. But now looking back, I'm like, holy cow. And especially working with autistic children, I see myself every day in them. Granted, they're a little bit more severe on the spectrum, but I still see parts of me in them all the time, every single day, which is probably why I can connect with them so easily, Anyways, that was a tangent.
I'm sure it won't be the last one you go on in this episode.
I think that this is where this conversation becomes a little emotional for a lot of women, though, because a lot of women aren't out there, saying, oh, I'm neurodivergent. I mean, I'm sure some are because they've been diagnosed, but for a lot of ones that are late diagnosed that don't really know it, they're not out there saying, oh, I'm neurodivergent. It's what they're really thinking is like, why does this life feel so much harder for me than it does for everyone else? Or why am I exhausted all the time? Why do I overthink everything? Why do relationships seem so emotionally intense? All of these things. Why do I feel so deeply? Why do I constantly feel like I'm trying to keep up with a world that wasn't built for the way that my brain operates? So many questions that we have. We're not out there saying, well, I'm neurodivergent, no, these questions present in very different ways. And over time, when women start collecting these diagnoses based on symptoms instead of someone looking at the entire picture, for me personally, rejection sensitivity, we've talked about this before in an earlier episode. I think it was a couple of ones ago. Anyways, the rejection sensitivity dysphoria was huge for me, even before I knew what it was. I didn't even realize what RSD was until probably, I want to say 2-3 years ago, something like that. Excuse me. I spent so much of my life believing that I was too sensitive or too much. But when you really understand RSD through a neurodivergent lens, you realize it's not emotional weakness. It's actually a nervous system response. And for a lot of us neurodivergent women, rejection or even the perception of rejection can feel physically painful. And I know when I say that every part of my upbringing, and this not to do with my parents really, but like just everything in my life, when I say that it felt like a threat, I mean everything felt like a threat. And so that's where and I didn't understand why everything felt like a threat. And it's because my nervous system was just at capacity and I could not handle anything. So everything that was coming at me felt like a threat. It can trigger things like spiraling thoughts, panic, shutdowns, people pleasing, the obsessive replaying of conversations in your head. Like, oh my God, that is real. And please don't think you're some weirdo or something's wrong with you if you have that happen, because trust me. Yes, trust me. And I still catch myself doing it from time to time. Like, I replay conversations in my head all the time, especially growing up. Again, I still do it from time to time, and I have to stop myself. But it can also show up as
I have more of the conversations that haven't happened yet. I replay those.
Yeah, like yes, absolutely. Like, you replay how you're going to,
and it never happens the way you think it's going to. Come on.
Yeah,
but no,
trust
anyway,
me, I do it too. But I'm also in a season of trying to learn how to position my wording. And so I think that's why it's kind of coming back for me a little bit, because I'm trying to word it in a different way that's not so direct. Anyways, I do that too. I do that one probably more than I do the replay of past conversations. But again, it can also show up as emotional overwhelm, hypervigilance. I know hyperindependence, all those things. I remember my parents used to always tell people that my daughter would fall on her face before she would ask for help. She's just so independent and can do anything, and she can handle anything that life throws at her. And for a long time, I used to be like, yeah, I guess I am super independent, blah, 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 even though I knew I was independent. But there came a point in my healing journey that I looked back and I was like, wow, that's not cool. Like, that's not something that you should be wearing like a badge of honor. Like, that's a trauma response. That is someone that carries RSD, that carries, abandonment wounds, that carries a lot, hypervigilance, all these things, and shows up like she can handle everything that's thrown at her because she couldn't count on anybody to help her. She couldn't count on anybody to really follow through with what they said they were going to do or support her in a way that she needed support. I learned to do it on my own because I couldn't count on anyone. Anyways, so later in my teens, bipolar disorder even entered the conversation. And looking back, I know I can recognize now how much medications even how much the medications I was on likely impacted my personal emotional regulation during that period of my life. I was on, specifically, I was on Depakote. And there is so much I can say about this. I remember when I first started, they had to have me on the capsule form because I could not swallow a big horse pill. So all of these things, the diagnosis, all these things were already traumatic in itself. But in my teens, I finally upgraded to this big ass horse pill, and I took it for years. And I think I was like 16, I was 17. And I woke up one morning and my dad sat on the edge of my bed and he goes, "Hey, sis." I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Can we talk for a minute?" And I said, "Sure." He goes, "I just want to say that I think maybe we should probably go get you assessed for bipolar disorder." And I said, "Excuse me, what?" He goes, "I'm serious." He goes, "I swear if you would have had a gun in your hand yesterday when we had our argument, that you would have shot me." I said, "There is no way in hell that I would have ever done that." But it put things in a perspective for me that I knew intuitively, even at 17. And again, I've been intuitive my whole life, but I didn't really know how to work with that. But I knew something inside of me was telling me I didn't need that medication anymore. As epilepsy childhood form, you most likely 9 times out of 10, you will grow out of childhood form epilepsy. And they were actually kind of skeptical if I would or not, because I had 2 different kinds. But I knew at that point that I no longer needed the medication. Now, against medical advice, I took myself off of the medication by myself instead of under the guidance of my neurologist. And he was very upset with me. But luckily, nothing happened, and that bipolar, the signs of bipolar went away. But I should preface that the medication that I was on, Depakote, is also treated for migraines and bipolar disorder. And I know that from being on Ritalin for my ADHD, younger than that even, that when you take something that you need, it does what it's supposed to do. But if you take a medication that you do not need, it does the opposite effect, right? And so this is what, like, my intuition that was telling me this. I formed this thought like, oh, I don't need this anymore. It's actually presenting as bipolar now because I don't need that medication anymore. And lo and behold, when I stopped taking it, everything disappeared. I didn't have any more seizures. I didn't have any more, episodes of what my parents thought were bipolar disorder. So I think it's really important to recognize that even the medications that you're on can affect how you emotionally regulate and all of these things too. They affect your nervous system just as much as the disorder does. I'd love for you to speak more about the overlap between the neurodivergence and the misdiagnosis, things like, like anxiety, bipolar, depression, things like that. Because I think a lot of women out there right now listening are going to, or that will listen, are going to recognize themselves in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get into that though, I want to touch on a couple of things that you just said. First, when you were diagnosed with the seizures, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
were emphasizing the fact that seizures are hereditary and they're not hereditary for you. That should have been that doctor's first clue to dig more into what was going on,
You're right.
because when you and I'm sure I'll get into this a lot more in next week's episode, but when something doesn't make sense, and this is the thing that irritates me about the medical field, which again, I won't go on my rant today, but when you're saying epilepsy is hereditary, but nobody else in my family has it, okay, well then why is it presenting itself? There must be another underlying cause. And that should have been their entry point to figure that out. I just wanted to point that out.
Well, upon my research too, I did find out that it's not always hereditary. It can be conditional as well. But the way that it was presented to us then was
Right.
like, oh, nope, it's hereditary. And
Yeah.
so there's someone in your lineage that has it. And we're like, nope, nope, not that we know of. So go ahead.
Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. But another thing that you said about, the being super emotional and all of these things that present in neurodivergent people, this brings me back to, many of the things that we've already talked about. So society has programmed women to not talk about their emotions, that it's a sign of weakness, that, we're meant to be strong. And, even with the hyper independence, we're programmed to be a certain way. And we are emotional beings. We are
Mm-hmm.
emotional. Women, divine feminine energy, we're emotional. And everybody is, but we're just talking about women at the moment. So we are already emotional beings. And when you add the neurodivergence on top of that, because of those hormonal fluctuations that we've been talking about, now it's hypersensitive. So it's not just normal emotional feeling. Now we're feeling it to the extreme. And so that's why a lot of
Mm-hmm.
us, I think, especially by the doctors and things that we've seen, are, if they don't dig into that neurodivergence part of it, which they haven't until recently, right, in women. So they think that we're crazy and they tell us that we're crazy. And a lot of the misdiagnoses that we get are anxiety disorder, depression, BPD, bipolar disorder. And when
Yep.
in that constant hypervigilant state, because your nervous system has, constantly been like trying to process all of these things in such a hypersensitive state, you can also be misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue because you're just so exhausted because your nervous system is
Yep.
constantly on alert. And then the hyper independence part of it, like when we are children and we're told, because I went through the same thing, like, oh, well, because I always thought my mom loved my brother more than me. I'm just gonna throw that out.
Yep.
My brother
Yep.
had more attention. My brother, and we've had this conversation before, but it's like, you're so independent. I know you can handle this on your own. Okay, well, guess what? I'm a freaking child. Just because I can handle it on my own doesn't mean I should have to. And even as an adult, just because I can handle it on my own doesn't mean that I have to. And this is why having a support system is so important. And even, I'm going to touch on this later, but even when you go see a doctor and you want to advocate for yourself, having someone else there who can, vouch for you and be like, yes, just like your parents, could have done back then. Like, no, there is nobody. And Doug, and I'm not blaming your parents or anything like that, but like just using it
Yeah,
as
no.
an example.
I
But
don't think, I honestly don't think that they knew. They didn't,
right.
they never had to deal with something like this. So they just didn't know.
Right. But the BPD thing and the bipolar disorder thing that you went through, like I went through the same thing. Like, but I was also an empath too. So now I'm
Yep.
neurodivergent and I'm an empath. So I'm not only feeling all of these emotions so hypersensitive, but now I'm feeling the collective energy, the energy of everyone else. And I was a chaotic teenager. I'm not gonna lie. I was a cutter because I was like, I need to feel something that I can recognize because it was just chaos all the time around me between the emotions and the energy. Um, my dad was like, "What the hell is going on, with you?" And it presented as depression and anxiety, but it was just that influx of all of this stimuli, energetic, emotional, sensitive, the senses, all of the overstimulation from being autistic as well and not knowing it. It's just this influx of so much that, like, how do you expect us to act, especially if we're not diagnosed properly, if it's not looked at from the root cause and you're just looking at all of the surface things and just assuming that, oh, you're just too emotional. I'm sorry, you're just too emotional. Let's put you on some medication that will make you less
Right.
emotional.
Right.
And like you were talking about with the medication, like when you take a medication, the whole point of that medication is to, if you look at the symptoms, the whatever your diagnosis is, say it's, a, neurotransmitter imbalance, like you're not getting enough serotonin. So they're going to give you a drug that's going to produce more serotonin. And this is why it's so hard to get off of it, because now your body thinks you're producing it and it stops producing it until, that
But that's also the fake stuff too. I mean, if I'm understanding that correctly, it doesn't even help bring the normal stuff. It's like a produced serotonin, isn't it? Like
it,
it
a lot of them
does
are,
that make sense?
yes, it's synthetic because it's coming from the medication rather than from the body. But my point is,
Right.
when you take the medication that's supposed to give you more serotonin, but the serotonin isn't your problem, now you're getting more serotonin because you're getting what your body's naturally producing on top of the medication because you've been misdiagnosed. So like you said, it's going to escalate those things and make it seem like, okay, I'm taking a bipolar medication, even though I'm not bipolar. It's giving me these, influx of neurotransmitters and hormones that I don't necessarily need. So yeah, now it's going to look like I have that because even though I'm on the medication, because it's doubling up what I'm already getting because that's not what I need. Anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a very important piece to understand before you actually start a medication, either with yourself or for your child or whatever it may be, is asking those deeper questions. Like, we need to know that this is the right diagnosis. Like, could this present as something else? What are those things that it could be presented with something else? Are we looking deep enough? Is there something else that we're not seeing clearly? Asking these deeper questions so that that you're, and again, we're doing the best that we can with the tools that we know how, so don't beat yourself up if you did take a medication that you did not need, or maybe you do in the future. You're learning just because you're human. So I just wanted to preface with that. I
We've all
do
been
think though, um, like we've said, I think in every episode, I think perimenopause is where it becomes the breaking point for so many neurodivergent women, because it's like suddenly everything just stops working, you toss your hands up and you're like, what the hell? Why can't I do things that I normally could do? Why can't I regulate or settle like I used to? Why do I just can't handle life in the same way that I could before? I think, and for years, many women survived through all of this masking and perfectionism and, adrenaline and hypervigilance and all the things, overachieving, people pleasing. I mean, all the things we could go on, the list could go on. But then when your hormones start shifting, estrogen changes, dopamine changes, sensory tolerance changes. I mean, executive functioning, like, and a lot of people, until you really dive into neurodivergence, you don't even know what executive functioning is. I had to learn that.
Mhm.
Um, and suddenly those things that once felt manageable just aren't. And I think that's what becomes so exhausting for a lot of women. I think, and that's why so many women in their 40s are suddenly just beginning to question autism and ADHD for the very first time, because they're seeing it through a completely different lens. They're seeing themselves through a completely different lens that they've never identified with before. And so now it all is starting to make sense if somebody, whether that's, like we said in a previous episode, when you get your kid diagnosed, you're like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. This is me, and it's not because you suddenly just become neurodivergent. You have probably your whole life. You've just been masking for so long that it's become your identity. And that is exhausting to hold. Um, you want to speak more on that a little bit?
No, I mean, you're absolutely correct. Those, because, if you look at your baseline when you're growing up, right? And let's say that you're undiagnosed neurodivergent, you have a baseline. Normal people are here, but you get comfortable with your baseline, right? Because you learn to
Mm-hmm.
mask, you learn to cope, right? But then you figure out how to manage that gap. But then when perimenopause comes, well, now your hormones are changing again. So now your new baseline is down here. And you're like, holy crap. So everything that you learned to fill that gap is now brought back to light because that baseline has changed again. And so, of course, those masking and coping mechanisms that you were using before aren't going to work anymore because now that gap is much bigger. And now you're older, you have a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more wisdom, you're maybe a little bit more self-aware about your body. We have this new education and these new resources out there that are geared towards women and are talking about autism and ADHD and things that weren't back then, especially for the women, in the age group of going through perimenopause. So
Mm-hmm.
now we have that information, and we're like, oh, okay, well that makes sense. But again, like it everything goes haywire when that perimenopause kicks in because those hormone levels are completely changing again. Your body is changing again. The gut brain axis is changing again because of all the food that you've been putting in your system and all the things. So like you have that whole lifetime of experience of environmental factors, of diet, of exercise or not exercise, of all these things that are going to make your body change anyway. But now you bring in that emotional and the mental part of it as well with the hormones and everything. Your whole body it's like you're a completely different person, and it's very frustrating, especially if you're able to recognize the fact that you're like, I thought I figured this out already, referring to those mask
Mm-hmm.
coping mechanisms. I thought I figured this out already. Why is it changing again? Because again, we've mentioned this before. Nobody prepares you for perimenopause. Nobody prepares you for menopause. Nobody prepares you for any of this. The only thing that I was told from my mom was, oh my God, I'm having heat flashes. Oh, I went into menopause early.
Right.
And I'm like, great, that's what I have to look forward to. Like, I'm already in my 40s. Like, when am I going to start having heat flashes? Like, I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like a little
Oh,
dehydrated. I had a dream and I get a little sweaty and I'm like, oh my God, it's over. But that's not the case. You know what I
just an
mean?
FYI, I learned upon my research that not all women in perimenopause, menopause have hot flashes.
No, they
You
don't.
can also be the woman that has cold flashes, and i.e., that's me. I don't have hot flashes. I have cold flashes where
I'm,
I'm like bone chilling cold and cannot warm up.
you know what, at
Like
this
it is,
point,
and that is just as exhausting as having hot flashes.
yeah, at this point though, like
I would much rather be hot than cold.
I don't want to jinx myself because I haven't started getting those symptoms if I do get those symptoms. But I'm cold all the time and have been my entire life. Those hot flashes might be a little welcome by now, but I'm just saying.
Right.
But I'm joking. I'm taking it in jest. It is a serious thing. I'm not diminishing hot flashes at all. I've seen my mom go through them. They don't look pretty or fun.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, so you're now at this new baseline that you have to kind of figure things out at, and it's difficult. It's very frustrating. So yeah.
It is very frustrating. And I just want to, I know I shared a little bit of like personal stories or whatever, but I always, this is why it's so important to me now, is because when I was younger and having to navigate all this, having to navigate the diagnosis, having to navigate the medication, having to navigate why me?
Mhm.
Like, why am I the only one in my family that has to navigate not only epilepsy, but I have to navigate ADHD on top of it? And I knew, like, obviously, ADHD is a lifelong thing. And luckily for me, epilepsy was not. But I'm just like, why do all these things happen to me? Why can't I just be somewhat normal? It's already hard enough trying to navigate this life, being my brain being wired a little differently than most kiddos that I went to school with. I already got made fun of unmercifully. I already got, all of these things that were already traumatizing enough, and now I'm having to navigate something that nobody else in my family has. And that again was exhausting, and it was not just exhausting of having to navigate it. It was physically exhausting my body, nervous, like neurologically, it was exhausting my body. I would remember having seizures and knowing, once you have so many, you start to know when they're coming, and like the signs right before you have them. And mine always right like seconds before I would have one, the last symptom was I'd get tunnel vision. And so I knew that I needed to sit down quick because if I didn't, then because I would get hot flash, like I would sweat profusely, I would get like a little nauseous. Once that tunnel vision hit, I knew that I needed to sit because there was a possibility that, something worse than just staring off into space. They started that way, but over time they did escalate just a little bit, not to the point of like shaking or anything, just to the point where I would, it was so physically exhausting my brain that I would like temporarily, like, I guess not lose consciousness, but like almost pass out, like, and then I would be dead to the world. I would sleep for hours after that because my brain was so overstimulated and just at max capacity. It couldn't handle one more stimulation. And I just remember feeling so emotionally drained from it because why me? Like, why is it that life has to throw so many curveballs to somebody that's so young and doesn't understand this? And I know that there are lots of kids out there that struggle with so many different things, from autism to cancer to all things. And I'm not taking any of that away. But as somebody that has navigated these emotional, um, traumatic events, it's hard for a young child to handle all of that at once, and how do you expect them to grow up not having masked, not trying to fit into the boxes just to become somewhat normal so that you fit in, not being the oddball out. How do you not become that person? Even take ADHD out of it and just do that. Like, why are you the oddball that has to like you stare off into space like a weirdo and you can't, they think it was me being defiant, because I couldn't hear them. It's just so many things that looking back, I wish I could have had the fuller, the broader picture because it would have explained so much and we could have had a much different route. We could have had more support that I needed at the time, that my parents needed at the time to support a child with those, what's the word? I lost the word. Navigating these diagnoses. It's not just a failed like parenting. Like I can't blame my parents for not knowing, like they didn't know anything. They didn't know any better. But if we would have had the fuller picture, maybe they could have had the research or the support groups or other parents that they could have talked to. This
And
thing again.
that's why it's so important for, people to understand and have that understanding and compassion for the time period back then, because we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the literature, we didn't have, the support groups, because people didn't talk about it, people didn't understand it like they do now. And that's why it's so important to have those things and to recognize and to continue advocating for these things so that parents now can give their children the support that we didn't have, because they have access to those literatures, those resources. The medical system has more information, more studies, more research that they've done to provide that information, and the support groups and people being more open and talking about it more and coming out and being like, yes, my child has this thing, instead of like way back in the day when people would just be like, oh, there's something wrong with my kid, let's send him to a hospital, and forget that we even have a child. Like we've come so far from that, which is amazing. So the fact that people are being more open about it and talking about it and knowing that they're not alone, just like with anything else in the healing journey, knowing you're not alone, having someone else to bounce ideas off of, or have a sounding board, or share resources and information. Because if you don't see the right doctor, or the doctor doesn't have the resource or know about it, you know what I mean? Family physicians can only do so much.
Absolutely.
So if you don't have those resources, it's important to be able to find the right information or have the right support elsewhere that we didn't have back then. So,
and I think that's why it's hit so deeply now for me later in life, and especially owning a business now that supports neurodivergent and highly sensitive people, because I didn't have the support that I needed back then. And now, I have become the person that I needed most back then. And letting other people know that there's nothing wrong with them, that they're not broken, that it's not something that needs to be fixed. It's something that needs to be worked with,
right.
Working with it. And if people could just understand that, rather than looking at it from a lens of something's wrong with you, having more compassion rather than pointing the finger like you think differently than me, so you're weird,
right.
Or you're wrong, right? Like this I will literally die on this hill, because it is so important that people know that there's nothing wrong with them, that they're loved, that they're just as they are. They don't need anything else except for support. That's it. And when they start to finally feel safe in their own bodies, then they can start to actually heal, because their bodies have not been able to heal their entire lives, because they've been in survival mode, not even knowing it, because of whether that be neurologically, whether that be nervous system, whatever it may be. You didn't consciously even know that you were living in survival mode. And now, as an adult looking back, I needed that. I needed to have somebody that just said, you know what? It's okay. You're not broken, and I'm here for you. And I will work with you in whatever capacity you need. I will meet you where you're at. And I just, that's why this, and maybe this is why I had to go down that rabbit hole. Is to learn my devotion to this topic, and to this community. So I really think that this is the heart of the episode. The conversation's not just about collecting labels. It's really about compassion. And when you spend your whole life believing that you're lazy, dramatic, emotional, difficult, too sensitive, broken, the list goes on. It creates real wounds and wounds that you don't even know are being created, And then there's something incredibly powerful about finally realizing maybe you were never failing. Maybe you were just navigating a nervous system that never taught you how to understand. And that was a real important realization for me anyways. So I want to just thank you for sharing this space with me and holding space for me to open up about my personal experience. And thank you all for being here with us this week. We know these conversations are deeply personal for a lot of you. And if this episode resonated in any way, make sure to share it with someone who may need to hear it, because they're not alone. There's others out there that, can support you and that can walk alongside of you through this, maybe even sharing a piece of their story. So, also, I want to add to join us next week for our final episode, as we dive into how so many neurodivergent women are being, I guess people in general, not just women, but we're talking about perimenopause and neurodivergence. So how many of us neurodivergent women are dismissed, gaslit, and left undiagnosed by the systems that were never designed to fully understand them in the first place? And we're talking about the medical profession. So if you're interested in joining us for that one, we're talking all about being gaslit by the doctors. Heather, do you have anything that you'd like to leave everyone with?
No, I want to reiterate the fact that you're not broken and you're not wrong. You're not bad. There's nothing wrong with you. You have a nervous system that was never allowed to feel safe your entire life. It's been in hypervigilance, it's been in fight or flight, it's been in a hypersensitive state your entire life. And so it's going to have an effect, whether that's, wounds or trauma or, just fatigue, all the things. And it's important to listen to your body. You know your body, listen to it, and know that safety is possible. You can get there, but it's not your fault that you haven't yet, or it took a long time to get there. We've all been through it.
Absolutely.
There are women out there who have gotten onto the other side and have learned to work with it. It is possible, and yeah, you're not alone.
Yeah, we were all we're all just our own unique, beautiful selves that were beautifully designed by, a higher power. And I think that it's important to know that it's not it's not it's not it's not even if you're different, it doesn't you're meant to walk this path for a reason. And I know it's hard, but we'll get there, especially with the support. We'll all get there. So that's all I got.
All right.